Well, we work on the topic of invasive species, and what we were trying to do, a group of 15 people from throughout the world, we met at Cambridge University last September, and we were trying to identify what we felt were the emerging issues that we were going to be addressing over the next 10 to 20 years with respect to invasive species around the world. So we used what's called a modified Delphi technique, in which each of the participants was asked to identify what they felt were the two most important emerging issues. That information, they also had to provide a paragraph describing why they felt these were the most important issues. This information was then collated by one person who then asked all of the members to vote on what they perceived to be the most important issues. And then we randomly, without them knowing what the relative scores were, we randomly discussed each of the 40 topics that had been identified. And after the discussion over a number of days, we then had a blind blind voting system in which people were asked to score from low to high each of those 40 topics. After that was done, we were able to see that there was a real break point in the top 15 issues from the other 25 issues. And so those became the focus of our discussions. How were these 15 topics going to affect humans and wildlife over the coming 10 to 20 years? So the first one that I raised was use of genetically modified organisms for biocontrol purposes. Historically, if we had a problem, we would either say in a lake we might try to net the fish out, or if it was an invasive fish, or in some cases you might poison them or use whatever means you had available. We now have gene editing technologies that allow us to interfere with, in either a positive way or a negative way, reproductive cycles. And so there was a classic example last week down in the Florida Keys, where there was a controversy as to whether or not they should allow a British company to release genetically modified versions, males, of an introduced mosquito that is already present down in the Keys. This mosquito, called the Egyptian mosquito, is responsible for vectoring dengue fever, chikungunya, and most recently Zika virus to humans. And because we don't want humans affected by any of those viruses, all of which are introduced, we needed to find a way to reduce the mosquito population. Typically, populations are sprayed, but that's releasing toxins into the environment. So this British company developed a gene editing technology which would allow them to interfere with the reproductive cycle. The males that carry this edited gene mate with the wild females, and their offspring eventually die before they ever reach maturity. And so they claim that they can reduce mosquito populations by 90%. If you're reducing mosquito populations by 90%, then you're also dramatically reducing the likelihood that humans are going to be bitten by these mosquitoes, and the diseases probably will not be transmitted to humans anywhere near as much if you had not acted. The problem, however, comes that the law of unintended consequences, where a lot of people in the communities are concerned that these mosquitoes and the release of these genetically modified variants may cause unintended problems. Either in some cases people have a concern that the gene may spread to other species, or that it may harm other populations indirectly. So for example, if there are many species that would feed on mosquitoes, and if the mosquito population collapsed, what are the consequences for other species in that community? So on the one hand, we have this potential, which is very good, that we could potentially control organisms that cause spread of diseases to humans. Classic example in Hawaii, where we have one of the most classic examples of adaptive radiation and speciation is with a group of birds called the Hawaiian honeycreepers. And those honeycreepers have been dramatically reduced in population size. Some have gone extinct. due to avian malaria, which was introduced to the islands. So there's the possibility that you could use this type of gene editing technology to target the mosquitoes that spread malaria to these birds in Hawaii. But as I say, wherever the technology is used, there's usually a group of people that are opposed to it as well, because they don't know what the ultimate consequences are for the environment. That's a good question. There's certain gene constructs that one can use. The most classic one that's used right now is called CRISPR, and it simply allows you to insert genes that you know are either going to confer some type of harmful property, usually an impairment of reproduction, or conversely, you might be able to, if it's a beneficial effect you're seeking, you might be able to insert genes that confer enhanced growth on the species. And so the gene editing can be used for either beneficial or harmful purposes, to either allow species to grow better or to impair or kill them. The other technique that we addressed was the importance of genetics versus epigenetics. Genetics is the way that most people would consider evolution of species as occurring. Over each generation, we get slight changes in the genetic composition of the species, and with it, evolution proceeds. However, there's another mechanism called epigenetics, in which the phenotypic performance, or the performance that we see of an organism, will change depending on the environmental context that they're placed in. A good example would be temperature. If I take a species, and it might be a native species or an introduced species, and I grow it at 20 degrees Celsius, I get a certain performance output. If I take the same species and I put it in an environment that's 1 or 2 degrees warmer, it's possible that certain genes are going to be upregulated, other genes are going to be downregulated. The net result is that the performance of the species changes in that new environment. We know that the Earth is changing. We have climate warming occurring in certain parts of the world. That means that the performance of the species is expected to change. Right now, we don't know what the balance is, but in terms of overall change in a species, how important is genetics? How important is epigenetics? Good question. If one was to look at the major stressors of ecosystems and species around the world, we see dramatic changes that are typically due to habitat change in the terrestrial world. We modify habitats. I just came back from Florida, and every time I go down there, I want to cry, because I see more and more of the landscape being changed into housing subdivisions. That means that there's less room for the many species that live down there. So habitat destruction and habitat modification causes many, many species to go extinct. Another major factor, particularly in the marine world, is overexploitation. So we simply hunt or harvest too many of them, and that causes a huge problem. Most surveys that address this issue, the comparative importance of different topics, finds that invasive species is usually in the top 3 in terms of what causes species to go extinct. In certain parts of the world, particularly the islands in Hawaii and other islands throughout the South Pacific, invasive species is the leading cause of species extinction. Climate change is an emerging topic which holds tremendous potential for causing species, entire communities of species, to potentially change, and in some cases there may be some that go extinct. So looking forward, climate change is one that's obviously on the radar. We also know that these different stressors do not act independently. Climate change and invasive species go together as well. We know that as the Hawaiian Islands have warmed, many of these Hawaiian honeycreeper birds that I mentioned, they're affected by introduced malaria, and the only area where some of these species occur today, they no longer occur in the lowlands, because that's where the malaria mosquitoes are. They only occur in the highlands of Hawaii. And as the Hawaiian Islands warm, the amount of habitat available to these birds gets diminished. They get pushed farther and farther up the mountain slope, because that mountain slope is slowly warming from below. So there's clearly an interaction between many of these stressors, and the one I just described would be between climate change and invasive species. We think that this exercise allows us to try and forecast what are going to be the emergent issues. And that means that both scientists and policymakers can look at this, and if they accept that the 14 issues that we raise are the ones that deserve priority attention, ideally, both scientists and policymakers would first off study these issues, and secondly, they would make sure that there's sufficient funding so that people can study them.